and first responders. A recorded vote should take place about 2 o'clock Eastern, and we might also hear debate on plans to change the rules regarding the use of a filibuster. Now live to the Senate floor here on C-SPAN 2.
Lead our senators above all irrelevancies and trivialities to a unity of passion and purpose. Create in them an elevated and refined patriotism that will make them eager to know and do your will. May the words of their mouths and the meditations of their hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. In the awareness that without a vision the people perish, give our senators a fresh vision of the United States of America. Also, keep ever before them the dream of the better world that is yet to be. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., January 26, 2011. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Kirsten E. Gillibrand, a senator from the state of New York, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Madam President.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Following leader remarks, if any, there will be a period of morning business until 10:30 this morning. Senators will be permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each during that period of time. Republicans will control the first half. Majority will control the final half. At 10:30, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of S-Res 14, a resolution honoring the victims of the tragedy in Tucson, Arizona. There will be up to 3.5 hours for debate on the resolution prior to a vote. As a result, senators should expect a roll call vote about 2:15 today. Following the vote, we'll resume morning business with 10-minute limitations. Madam President, there are 3 bills at the desk due for their second reading.
The clerk will report the bills en bloc.
S-162, a bill to cut $500 trillion in spending in fiscal year 2011. S-163, a bill to require that the government prioritize all obligations on the debt held by the public in the event that the debt limit is reached. H.R. 2, an act to repeal the job-killing health care law and health care-related provisions in the Health Care and Education Reconciliation Act of 2010.
I object to any further proceedings with respect to each of these bills.
Objection is heard. The bills will be placed on the calendar.
Madam President, I would note the absence of quorum and ask the time be charged equally against both.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Without objection.
Charges against Republicans, you know.
Dakota.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business until 10:30 a.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half.
Madam President, I rise today to speak about the issues that I think are most important to the American public. And I appreciated the opportunity that I had last evening, along with the presiding officer, to sit and listen to the President's State of the Union address, which is an annual rite of passage where the President lays out his blueprint and his vision for the next year. And in those remarks, he did, as he did last year, touched on a number of themes that I think speak to issues that are important for the country to face. And certainly there were things in that speech that I agreed with in terms of the things that he said that we need to be focused on, some things that I didn't agree with. But I think in terms of the broader agenda, what strikes me about the speech is he talked about the need for tax reform, which is something I agree with. I think it's an issue of competitiveness. He talked about medical malpractice reform, which is something that many of us have been trying to get part of the health care reform debate in this country for a long time. Unfortunately, that got left on the cutting room floor last year. He talked about strengthening Social Security and entitlement reform, also a critical priority if we are serious about getting spending and debt under control. And he also talked about regulatory reform and looking at government reform and the types of things that we might be able to do to streamline or shrink or make more efficient the federal government. He also talked about the importance of enacting trade agreements, and I couldn't agree more. I think that trade is a critical part of our economy. Export opportunities for businesses in this country would create economic growth. They would create jobs. But unfortunately, again, those are trade agreements that have been stalled out here for some time in the Congress. What strikes me about the speech, Madam President, is this, and that is that last year we heard a lot of the same themes. The President this year, I forgot to mention, talked about a 5-year freeze on spending. Well, last year he talked about a 3-year freeze on spending. He talked about trade agreements a year ago. Many of those same themes were struck a year ago, and yet we haven't seen the results of the rhetoric. And what I would argue, I think, to the American people and to all my colleagues, that it's important that we judge people not by their rhetoric but by their actions. Don't watch what we say, watch what we do. I think that's true of anyone in public life. We all need to be judged by what we do and whether or not we follow through with the things that we say we are going to do. And so when the President talks about those priorities, I couldn't agree more. But frankly, Madam President, in order for any of those things to happen, it is going to take presidential leadership. If we're going to do something on tax reform, if we're going to do something on entitlement reform, if we're going to do something about spending and debt, the President is going to have to step forward with bold proposals in order to accomplish that, because bold things, big things, need to be done on a bipartisan basis. The opposite example of that, I think we saw a year ago when the health care reform bill was being debated on the floor of the United States Senate. This is something that impacts literally 1/6 of the American economy. And yet you had a bill that passed the Senate without a single Republican vote. And in fact, in most cases, Republicans were not included, were not consulted, did not have input into that piece of legislation. And so you had a bill, literally, a bill that impacts 1/6 of the American economy pass out of this chamber on a party line vote. That is historic, because in most cases, if you look throughout our nation's history, when this country needs to do big things, there is a bipartisan effort to try and get a bill that can attract broad bipartisan support. And so inasmuch as I support many of the things that the President said rhetorically last night, Madam President, I would argue that the proof is in the pudding. We are going to wait and see now whether or not his actions comport with his words, because the talk about spending and debt really rings hollow if, in fact, you aren't willing to take on spending in this country, spending in our government, and willing to take on the issue of entitlement reform. And in fact, notwithstanding the President's talk last year about a 3-year freeze on spending, we saw the largest buildup, the most massive expansion of government that we've seen literally since the 1960s. The health care bill is a $2.5 trillion new expenditure for the federal government when it's fully implemented. at a cost, I believe, it can be much larger than that over time when you start seeing these costs pile up and more people shifting over into the government program. Now, hopefully, we're going to have a vote here in the Senate. I believe we will have a vote. Our leader has indicated that we'll get a vote on repealing health care reform. In my view, before this thing begins to get implemented, it would make sense to throw it overboard and start over and do this right and do it in a way that attracts bipartisan support and actually does something to drive down the cost of health care rather than increasing it. Because what we've seen already is what we predicted would happen, and that is that insurance rates are going up, not down. The massive taxes in that bill, of course, get passed on, and so consumers end up paying more for their health care, not less. And I would argue that we're going to see some disastrous results from some of the pay-fors in the bill. The so-called Class Act, which is another new entitlement program, is something that even the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, a Democrat chairman, a year ago when this was being debated said it is a Ponzi scheme of the highest order, something that Bernie Madoff would be proud of. And it's got a tail on it that is going to create deficits in the out years and make the financial fiscal picture that we face even worse. There are so many things about this bill that argue for us starting over and doing it right. But I want to say this morning, Madam President, because I want to focus specifically on this issue of spending and debt. Much has been made of the fact that we're going to have a vote coming up on March 4th. The continuing resolution expires, at which point we will have to decide what we're going to do in terms of funding the government. I hope that debate, or the lead up to that vote, sparks a debate about spending. Because if we don't start getting spending under control, this problem that we have continues to snowball. We have a $14.3 trillion debt. And the other point I would make is there's another big vote looming sometime between late March and early May and in the April time frame, most likely, where we're going to have to raise the debt limit. We're already at $14.3 trillion in debt as a nation. And we're going to have to extend the nation's borrowing authority above that so that we can finance the government. Now, we have maxed out the credit card. We cannot do this any longer. We don't have the luxury of time. When you're facing a $14.3 trillion debt, much of which we owe to other countries around the world, we put ourselves at great peril. We put our economy at great peril. I would argue it's a national security issue, and I'm not the only one saying that, Madam President. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, said a few months back that the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. Now, that is the top-ranking military official in this country saying that it isn't, when he talked about the greatest threat to America's national security, he could have talked about al-Qaeda, he could have talked about the Iranian nuclear program, he could have talked about China, he could have talked about North Korea, but what did he say? The greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. That speaks volumes about what we need to be focused on and what we as public officials here in the United States Senate need to devote our energies to. And so when we think about that, there are a couple of things that obviously you can do. Now, I have advocated, and as have others, that we go back to the 2008 spending levels, because in the last 2 years we have seen spending on the non-national security discretionary part of the budget increase by 21% at a time when inflation in the overall economy is 2%. So the government has grown at 10 times the rate of inflation in the last 2 years. When the President talks about freezing spending this year, he is, in my view, dealing with an issue that really, the only analogy I can use, it's like closing the barn door after the horse has already gotten out. We have a major problem. We have a dramatic run-up in spending in the last 2 years, and freezing it now will enshrine and lock in to the baseline that massive increase in spending. If we go back to the 2008 levels, it will be painful. But we don't have the luxury of not dealing with this now. It's going to be painful, but it's going to be necessary if we're serious about providing a better future for our children and grandchildren. The alternative, Madam President, is we continue to run up these $1.5 trillion deficits year over year, and adding significantly more to that debt and putting ourselves on a trajectory when I think our economy is in great peril in the future. Now, that's one aspect of it. We talk about the non-national security discretionary part of the budget. Of course, the security or the national security part of the budget is already being scrutinized and scrubbed. The Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates has made it clear that they are going to try and find savings and efficiencies in there on the tune. In fact, they've already, I think, determined that they can save somewhere on the order of $150 to $170 billion in the defense budget over the next 5 years. But then you've got this other part of the budget, the entitlement program, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which, of course, Medicare and Medicaid are driven by health care costs. And until we figure out what we're going to do on health care to rein that in, to get that cost under control, it's going to be complicated to try and fix Social Security, or to try and fix Medicare and Medicaid. But that being said, I think that's what argues for actually putting remedies in place that will put downward pressure on health care costs, on utilization, so we can bring health care costs back into control. And there are a number of good ideas out there about how to do that. The Debt Commission made some recommendations, although most in the area of Medicare and Medicaid were largely cosmetic, because they couldn't come to an agreement about how to fix health care. Social Security, on the other hand, Madam President, is available. It can be fixed. And I think that the Debt Commission made a series of recommendations. I hope the President and his team will take seriously and come to the Congress. I think Republicans here in Congress are willing to work with him, because that's something that we can put on a sustainable path. We ought to do it, and we ought to do it now, because the longer we wait, the worse the problem becomes. And so you've got the entitlement issues, you've got non-national security discretionary spending, things that can be done that this President, if he's willing to put his rhetoric into action and take leadership, can actually put up a record of accomplishment for the American people. The alternative is we continue to add to the $14.3 trillion debt. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say for a moment that it isn't, that we aren't all responsible for this. Obviously, there were previous administrations and previous Congresses. We have gotten where we are today because we didn't make the hard choices when we should have, and now the choices become much harder. But I would also say, Madam President, that in the last 2 years, that debt has grown by over $3 trillion. Largely because of a $1 trillion stimulus bill that we borrowed from our children and grandchildren, which didn't do anything to create jobs, but did add $1 trillion to the debt, and the health care bill, which, again, the costs of, many of the costs of that we are going to see into the future, but it has a profound impact on the fiscal picture that the country is going to be dealing with and going to be facing. What does it mean to finance a $14.3 trillion debt? Well, it means this. We spend so much on interest that next year the amount that we spend on interest will equal the amount that we spend on national security. I mean, think about that. The entire national security defense budget to defend this country, that amount of money will be equaled by the amount that we spend on interest to finance the debt. And that continues to explode in the years ahead. And if for some reason we were to have a run-up in interest rates, if something happened in the economy, which with inflation starting to take off a little bit, generally interest rates would follow that, and at some point in the not-too-distant future, you could see interest rates tick up. Well, we've been able to manage our debt by the way that we financed it and short-term borrowing. If you saw interest rates reset and go up, it would have an even more profound impact on the amount that we pay to finance that debt and the amount that we make in interest payments. Every child in America today under the age of 18, Madam President, owes $114,000 because of that debt. In 6 years from now, it'll be $196,000. What are we doing to future generations when we saddle them with this enormous debt and put them in a position where they are going to be faced with a lower standard of living and a lower quality of life than what we've experienced simply because we didn't have the courage to make the hard decisions that were necessary to get this situation under control? And so, Madam President, I would suggest to my colleagues, to the President after his speech last night, that this is not about talk, it's not about rhetoric, it's about action. It's about what the American people asked us to come here and do. And I think there were three messages coming out of the election last fall. The American people want us focused on jobs in the economy, they want us focused on spending, and they want us focused on debt. And we're going to have an opportunity in the next few months when the continuing resolution expires and we look at the issue of funding the government into the future to deal with the issue of spending. When we get to the debt limit vote that will come up sometime this spring, we will have an opportunity to talk about the debt. But it ought to generate and spark a serious effort here in the Congress. Not a cosmetic one, not a superficial one, not a one where we provide lip service, but where we are serious about reining in spending. Not just non-national security spending, but also looking at the long-term issues that are going to affect this country's balance sheet well into the future, and those are our entitlement programs. It's going to be tough stuff. It's not easy to do this. I can't help but think that if we had made some of these hard decisions a few years ago, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in today. I came here as a freshman congressman back in 1997, and one of the first votes we had, big votes I should say, on the floor of the House of Representatives at the time, was a vote on a balanced budget amendment, something that 38 states, I think, have. Our state of South Dakota has a balanced budget amendment, which means our legislature and governor can't go home until they balance the budget. That vote passed. It takes two-thirds majorities in both the House and the Senate and 38 states to ratify to get a constitutional amendment approved. We got a big, larger than two-thirds vote in the House of Representatives at that time. It came to the United States Senate, and it failed by one vote. 67 votes here is the magic number to get the two-thirds threshold. It got 66 votes in the United States Senate 14 years ago, Madam President. I can't help but thinking how much better our financial picture would be today had we taken that step back in 1997 and put a balanced budget amendment, enshrined that into our Constitution, and imposed a discipline on the Congress that hasn't existed. And clearly, politicians here in Washington, it is too easy when it comes down to making hard choices, to take the easy way, and that is to just hand the bill to our children and grandchildren. It's time to stop. We can't afford this any longer. We're at $14.3 trillion and adding $1 trillion every single year. And so this is going to require tough decisions, hard decisions, but I believe this is a great country with great people. We have met big challenges before. I think the American people are ready to step forward and deal with this challenge. I think they're looking for political leadership in this country to do that, to join them in that quest. It starts, as I said before, the presidential leadership is critical to this. It's going to take leadership here in the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives. But we cannot afford to kick the can down the road any further, to punt the ball to the next generation. It is not fair to them. And for generations in this country, we have had a sort of guiding principle, and that is that one generation sacrifices so the next generation can have a better life. We may be the first generation that turns that ethic on its ear and asks the next generation to sacrifice because we haven't been willing to live within our means. And so I hope that we can muster the courage that is necessary, and I'm going to do everything I can to continue to shine a light on this issue as we get into these budget debates. I frankly have a series of budget reforms. I think that absent a constitutional amendment, we ought to be putting some statutory reforms in place that would force downward pressure on spending here. I've got a bill that calls for a two-year or biannual budget where we budget in 1 year, in the odd-numbered years and the even-numbered years we do more oversight. And so that when people here are running for re-election, instead of worrying about how to spend more money to curry favor with a particular constituency, we're doing oversight and looking at how we can save money, for the next generation. And so I'd like to get a debate on that. I think we ought to make the budget resolution that we pass here binding and give it the teeth and the force of law, which it doesn't have today. I think that there are a series of prescriptions, Madam President, that would be worthwhile for us to not only entertain but hopefully implement to really take seriously the challenge that is before us. So I thank the Chair for the time, and I look forward to engaging the debate about spending and about debt and how to better create jobs in this economy for the American people, which is what I think they want us focused on, and I hope that it will be not just rhetoric but action that follows. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Illinois.
How much time is remaining in morning business on the minority side?
6 minutes and 47 seconds.
I ask unanimous consent to reserve that time. I don't believe there's another Republican senator on the floor.
Without objection.
And ask consent to begin the Democratic side of the morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I listened closely to the speech given by the senator from South Dakota about the deficit, and I was thinking as he gave the speech that it was a good one, but a little bit of history is, I think, warranted at this moment. In the year 2000, 11 years ago, President William Jefferson Clinton was leaving office. We had gone through a period of budget surplus. We were taking the budget surplus generated each year and buying more longevity in Social Security as a program. It was a very positive situation. The national debt of America when President William Jefferson Clinton left office was $5 trillion. Cumulated debt of America from George Washington to the end of William Jefferson Clinton, $5 trillion. And as President Clinton left office, he said to President Bush, I want to give you in the next year a $120 million surplus in terms of what you can anticipate to happen in the next year. It was a pretty positive situation with a lot of job creation, businesses doing well, and homes being built. Now fast forward from 2000 to 2008. 8 years later, let's take a snapshot. What was the state of the economy? Well, we were facing unemployment at record levels and numbers growing by the month. We no longer had a national debt of $5 trillion. 8 years later, after President George Bush, that national debt was $12 trillion, more than doubled in an 8-year period of time. And the obvious question is, what happened? Why were we doing so well 8 years before and had fallen so badly into this situation 8 years later? Well, we had 2 wars that were not paid for. We just added those to the national debt in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had tax cuts even to the wealthiest people in America, something that had literally never occurred in the history of the United States, and that added directly to the debt. And we had programs unpaid for, signed by the President into law, very expensive programs, even in the area of Medicare. Accumulate those things with the 9/11 occurrence and the downturn in the economy, and we saw our national debt go from $5 trillion to $12 trillion. And instead of President Bush leaving new President Obama a surplus for the next year, they anticipated a $1.2 trillion deficit in the next year as President Bush left office. That is what Barack Obama inherited 24 months ago. 24 months ago. And now, to hear some of the comments being made, you would think that President Obama had created the deficit crisis in America. He inherited a deficit crisis from President George Bush. And he said the first thing we need to do is get this economy up and running. The Republicans were virtually no help. Only 3 Republican senators joined us in a stimulus bill, which is now being mocked and criticized. But in fact, 1/3 of the stimulus bill was in tax cuts. Tax cuts to working families to help them through a recession. Another 1/3 safety net, unemployment insurance, as well as help to state and local governments. And the final 1/3, infrastructure, building roads and bridges and things across America for our economy. That's what the stimulus package was. Did it bring us back in a hurry from our recession? No, but it stopped the decline in our economy, and we are bringing ourselves back now. There's more consumer confidence being demonstrated than we've seen in a long, long time. I was a member of President Obama's Deficit Commission. And, Madam President, for the record, I want people to know that that Deficit Commission by the President originally was legislation. It was a statute. We were going to enact a law to give this commission the authority to come up with a report and force Congress to vote on it. Powerful stuff, with a lot of bipartisan support. When this powerful piece of legislation came to the floor of the United States Senate, 7 Republican senators who were co-sponsors of the bill, 7 of them came to the floor and voted against the bill that they co-sponsored. This effort to try to deal with our budget deficit in real, honest terms. Well, after their vote, after the statute failed, the bill failed, the President said, I'll create one by executive order. I served on it. It was Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson co-chairing an effort with 18 members, and at the end of the day, 11 of us, including myself, signed on to the final report. I always put the caveat, and I think most would. I don't agree with all of it, but I think it was the closest we were going to come to facing a terrible crisis in America. The crisis is this. Out of every dollar we spend in Washington, we borrow 40 cents. That's unsustainable. Whether we're using that dollar to build a missile or to pay for food stamps doesn't make much difference. We have to borrow 40 cents for every dollar we spend. Where do we borrow the money? Well, one of our major creditors was in town last week, President Hu Jintao of China, a major creditor and a major competitor, which takes me to the President's State of the Union address last night. The Republicans are fixed in one particular area. They believe that the sum and substance of all that we do in Washington should be focused on the deficit. I think the deficit is critically important. I voted for the Deficit Commission report. I think we have to do things that are unpopular, and we have to do them in a sensible and timely way. But it isn't the whole story. What the President tried to remind us last night is that we also have a great American economy. And we have to ask ourselves, will that economy be able to compete in the world of the 21st century? How will we do against competitive nations like China, Japan, and Germany? Those are questions asked by the President last night, and I've heard many Republican senators, Congressmen since say, oh, those investments, that spending, we don't need it. What we need to do is to focus on the deficit. I think the President got it right. I think the President is calling for balance here. Responsible deficit reform and investments in America that make a big difference in who we are and what we can be. The President talked about the Sputnik moment last night, Madam President, long before you were born. The Sputnik moment, October 4th, 1957, is when the Soviet Union launched the satellite, Sputnik, into outer space. It scared us to death. Because here, this nemesis of the United States in the Cold War, the Soviet Union, with the capacity to develop a bomb that could destroy major parts of America, was now in outer space and we weren't. They had a missile that launched a satellite. It was a tiny little thing, about the size of a basketball, and it circled the Earth. And at that time, in October of 1957, a chill set in on Capitol Hill when people got to thinking, you know, maybe we aren't as good as we thought we were when it came to math and science and education if the Russians beat us into outer space in 1957. Congress did something in 1958 in response to that that was historic and considered radical at the time. Congress came up with something called the National Defense Education Act. It was the first time in the history of this country when we had offered college loans to those other than veterans, and it was a program that was going to reach across America and try to put more young people in college. Did it work? Look at the numbers. In 1940, 15% of college-age students in America went to college, about 500,000 students in college. In 1958, we started the loan programs. By 1960, the number of students, college-age students in college had grown to 3.5 million. 2 years later, I was one of them. Now, fast forward 10 more years to 1970. By 1970, 7.5 million students in America were in college. 40% of college-age students were going to college. The investment of this government into the National Defense Education Act and student loans democratized higher education, dramatically increased the number of students in colleges and universities, and I would say not only prepared us for man on the moon and NASA, but prepared our economy for more important things to come. Let me give you one example. When Sputnik was circling the globe, our scientists were sitting there upset and frustrated that the Russians were the first in space. Up in Baltimore here, there were two scientists at a laboratory, and they decided that they would try to track the Sputnik satellite. The Russians, in order to prove that they were actually doing something, were emitting a signal from this satellite, this little basketball-sized satellite. These scientists up in Maryland said, let's see if we can find that signal, find the frequency. And they did. And then they used, and I'm going to get lost here in a hurry because I'm a liberal arts lawyer, they used something called the Doppler effect to determine where the satellite was circling the globe and the speed of it. And they told some people what they had found at the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense challenged them and said, well, if you can tell us where the satellite is, how fast it's moving, could you kind of reverse that equation? We would like to know if we had a satellite in outer space, whether we could figure out where your radio receiver was. And so they did the calculations and did the work, and they determined it. The purpose in asking the question was so that we could reach a point in national defense when if the Russians launched a missile with a bomb on it toward the United States, we could tell where it came from and launch one in return. So we did this calculation, and we started making the development of this in 1958, where we could figure out where the receiving station was on Earth if there was a transmitting satellite. If it sounds like it might have led to something, it did. It led to a situation today where I can carry in my pocket here a BlackBerry which has a GPS. GPS came out of that calculation. And now we can basically determine, someone can determine where Durban is by where his cell phone is. That has become common technology and science. But it was research by the federal government that led us 50 years later to this moment. I say that because I think the President was trying to make that point last night. When it comes to the future of our economy and where we're going to be and whether we'll be competitive, we need to invest. It's not a bad word, it's a good word. We need to invest in our country, in people so that they have the education and training so they can compete, in businesses so they have basic research and the kind of incentives for innovation so that they can move forward in growing their businesses and increasing the number of their employees, and in building the infrastructure of America that makes a difference. I will close because I see my colleague here from Rhode Island. There was a company a few decades ago that became very popular named Lands' End. And most people know it. It since has sold to Sears. They own it today. It's Lands' End. But when Lands' End was thriving, it was located in a small town in Wisconsin. And a lot of people wondered, how could you run a big mail-order operation out of a small town in Wisconsin? And the answer was they had put together enough infrastructure that it worked. There were enough highways and enough ways to provide their product by mail and other delivery all around the United States. Now we're in a new generation of challenge, and that generation of challenge is calling for technology. The President last night talked about our advancing the technology of computer reach to make sure that we have high-speed computer accessibility across the United States. That technology, innovation, and education is going to build a platform for us to be competitive. I think the President got it right. We deal honestly with the deficit. We don't do it so quickly that we make the recession worse, and we invest in our people so that we're ready to compete in the 21st century. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from New York.
First, I want to thank my colleague from Illinois for his, as usual, right-on-the-money words about the President's speech, and I want to say I anticipate eagerly my colleague from Rhode Island's speech, who graciously yielded the floor to me. Now, I rise to commend President Obama on the pitch-perfect State of the Union he delivered last night. His speech was smart and balanced, forward-thinking, and unabashedly upbeat about the future of our country. Fundamentally, the President spoke about the need to preserve the American dream, to bequeath its promise to our next generation as our parents bequeathed it to us. The American dream, as I see it, is very simple. It means that there's a strong likelihood that you'll be doing better 10 years from now than you're doing today, and an even greater likelihood that your children will be doing better than you did. Many people in America think that dream is in peril today. Some people even fear that America is in decline, that our greatest periods of prosperity are behind us. To these purveyors of gloom and doom, to those who are sour and dour, who think America and its government can't do anything right, the President sent a clear message. You could not be more wrong about America. We are and will remain the most economically vibrant, the most culturally vibrant country in the world, with the best system. We're the only country on earth, Madam President, that tells a young man or young woman, 12 or 13 or 14 years old, whether their family's been in this country 12 or 6 generations, or whether they're a new immigrant, that you can achieve the stars. No other country has that, and that's a precious, precious part of our birthright that remains alive and well today, as we see in the success of so many. It's true that we live in a much different world today than the generation that preceded us. The rules have changed. It's tougher to get ahead. Unemployment is unacceptably high, and the competition for jobs is real. The middle class feels squeezed. But as the President said, this shouldn't discourage us. It should challenge us. Last night, the President explained how we can rise to that challenge. He outlined how we can out-innovate, out-educate, and out-build the rest of the world, tapping the creativity and imagination of our populace. He urged us to invest in clean energy technology and other cutting-edge industries, and challenged us to put 1 million alternative fuel vehicles on the road by 2015. Thanks to the ingenuity of researchers like those at the GM fuel cell facility in Honeoye Falls, New York, near Rochester, I believe we can achieve this ambitious goal. I'm also hopeful we can take up and pass clean energy legislation in the months ahead. The President also called on Congress to reform No Child Left Behind in order to restore America's global leadership in education. I'm particularly pleased that the President enthusiastically endorsed a permanent extension of the $2,500 college tuition tax credit I authored 2 years ago. I'd like it to even be a little higher, to go to $3,000 this year. It's no secret that much of our nation's infrastructure is in disrepair, and that too many Americans do not have access to high-speed internet or high-speed rail. For America to stay ahead of our foreign competitors, we need to improve the ways in which we transport people and information. Since the days of Henry Clay, with the internal improvements, when our nation builds infrastructure, economic growth follows, and this has clearly always been a government function. The President clearly understands this fact and spoke to it last night. The President didn't just focus on growing jobs, the economy, and middle-class paychecks last night. He showed an acute awareness of the need to rein in federal spending to get our nation's fiscal house in order. I echo his call to consolidate or eliminate unnecessary government programs and to revisit and revise regulations that have long outgrown their usefulness. Of course we need to find balance, but I'm confident that more can and will be done to make our government more agile and efficient. The President had the right blend. Yes, cut out the waste. Even eliminate wasteful and inefficient and duplicative programs. But don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, or as he said, don't throw the engine off the airplane when the plane is overweight. And so the combination of growth, investment in our future, and innovation with fiscal moderation and reining in waste, it's just pitch perfect for the American people. And lastly, I want to applaud the President for addressing one of the most critical matters facing the country, our broken immigration system. As you know, I've championed comprehensive immigration reform for some time, and the President seemed to endorse many aspects of the approach. He likes the approach, bipartisan, that Senator Graham and I have put together. He has told us that several occasions. So I look forward to working with him, as well as my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, as we map a path to comprehensive reform in the 112th Congress. Madam President, some pundits and candy cappers said that Congress seemed subdued, even restrained last night. Well, if last night's speech didn't seem like the usual partisan pep rally, that's because it wasn't. The President's speech was not meant to appeal to Democrats or Republicans or even independents. It was meant to appeal to Americans. And in that, the President succeeded overwhelmingly. And the fact that we sat together, Democrats and Republicans side by side, was a fine fit with the President's appeal to the whole of America, not to one side or the other. The address last night embodied so many of the values and ideals that unite us as Americans. It displayed the kind of optimism that we relish, thrive on, and believe in. It was a great speech, a wonderful moment of comedy. I expect this moment will not fade soon, and I hope so, too. I yield the floor to my Island.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I would like to compliment my distinguished colleague from New York on his remarks, and I would like to add a few observations of my own, but I first wanted to echo very much what he said. What the President did last night was to point a finger towards the future. And some people were just capable of seeing the finger. But for most people, they really saw where he was pointing. And he has pointed us towards an important future for our country. These are the issues we're going to have to address in the decades ahead, and we have to be prepared now. And I wanted to touch about 3 areas that he pointed to. The first, of course, is infrastructure. I am not the only person in America who has noticed our crumbling infrastructure. Everybody who drives on our roads, everybody who goes across our bridges, everybody who has been to our water and sewage plants knows that we have underinvested in those areas for decades. As the President pointed out last night, America's own engineers give America a D for the status of our infrastructure. The Environmental Protection Agency has estimated that we have $662 billion in total capital needs for clean water and drinking water investments over the next 10 years. $662 billion that we need to put into our water and water treatment system in the next 10 years. By contrast, in the so-called stimulus bill, we put in $6 billion, 1% of what we need. We have a lot of work we still have to do to make sure that America has the clean water treatment and drinking water that it needs. And the infrastructure question is not just about infrastructure that the Romans could have built. It's not just about roads and bridges and waterworks. Many years ago, the President referred to a Sputnik moment and President Kennedy's drive to get us up into space and to accelerate our space program. When he pushed, President Kennedy, when he pushed to put a man on the moon within 10 years and bring him safely home, what that delivered was not just a man on the moon. What it delivered was the technology that allowed a company called ComSat, a public-private corporation, to put up into space the satellite technology that became the infrastructure of our modern communication system. That was done because of that call to action. And it's not just our communication system that is core infrastructure, as well as our roads and our bridges and our waterworks. It's also our information technology system, particularly in healthcare. When we build a robust health information infrastructure, so that as an American you're no longer carrying your cardboard file-covered records from appointment to appointment, no longer having to explain who you are and what you've got and what medications you're on and why you're there for the umpteenth time because the doctor hasn't seen your file because it's not available to him electronically. When we fix all of that so that your pharmacy, so that your specialists, so that the laboratories that you go to, so that the hospital, if you've had to visit it, are all connected to your primary care provider who is directing the care of you for your condition, that is a piece of infrastructure that, like our healthcare infrastructure, will enable enormous growth in the private sector. That's what infrastructure does. Roads aren't valuable because people go out with picks and shovels and bulldozers and asphalt pavers and make them. They're valuable because once they're made, commerce runs across them and the private sector expands. That's just as true of communications and information technology and broadband and our energy grid. We need to be investing in infrastructure, and we need to be thinking about our modern infrastructure, not just the infrastructure the Romans could build. The other point the President made that was critically important is that American manufacturing is not now competing on a level playing field with our foreign opponents. Many people have said this was a very America First speech, that the President seemed more nationalistic than he's been before, and I suspect that is because in his years as President, it has been driven home to him how many disadvantages our foreign competition puts our manufacturers at. It is not fair. It creates immense disabilities for them and real handicaps, and we've got to put American manufacturing back on a level playing field with their competitors around the globe. I can go to the Cranston Printworks company in Rhode Island, which is one of the last remaining vestiges of the vaunted Rhode Island textile industry. It was Rhode Island's textile industry that started the Industrial Revolution. Rhode Island's textile industry propelled Rhode Island to having more millionaires per capita than any other state in the country. And now it has winnowed away, and companies like Cranston Printworks that have been able to hang on and survive and be successful keenly know how bad the disadvantages are. And you can take their CEO, George Shuster, and he can give you a speech about how in almost every dimension of their operations, they are at a disadvantage, and very often a disadvantage that America has created against their foreign competition. And I just want to mention one. I've introduced the Offshoring Prevention Act because if George Shuster were to take his facility in Rhode Island and move it overseas, he could choose the year that he declared his profits and defer them to the most advantageous tax year. When he stays in Rhode Island, he has to declare his profits in that year no matter what. There is no reason on earth that we should reward an American company that moves its processes overseas with a tax deferral advantage that they don't get when they're here at home. And my Offshoring Prevention Act would prevent that. The last thing I want to say, because I see my distinguished colleague from Arizona here on the floor, and I want to make sure I leave him time, is just a word about our long-term debt. I was immensely gratified that the President took a firm position to defend Social Security. We all know, who are familiar with the actual facts here, that Social Security has never contributed a dime to our deficit, never contributed a dime to our debt, and that it is solvent for more than a quarter century ahead of us. It is not an immediate problem, and with very small adjustments, it can be a never problem. And in states like Rhode Island and New York, and I suspect Arizona as well, we have people who count on Social Security. Social Security gives us freedom. Social Security gives our seniors freedom from want and freedom from fear. It gives them freedom from privation and freedom from poverty. And it gives the younger generation freedom to pursue their own dreams, knowing that their parents will have a dignified old age because of Social Security, and they can take risks and seek opportunities that they would never otherwise be able to take if they had to know that they were the only support for their parents in their old age. If the only thing that stood between their parents and penury was them. Thankfully, Social Security gives that liberty to young people across this country, as well as the freedom it gives to old people. So I'm delighted that he took this stand and that Social Security will not be improperly thrown under the bus of the important debt and deficit reduction work that we need to do. And with that, I will yield. I see, again, Senator McCain is on the floor. He's a distinguished senator and a great friend, and I don't want to be taking time away from him. I yield the floor.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of S-Res 14, which the clerk will report.
S-Res 14, honoring victims and heroes of the shooting on January 8, 2011 in Tucson, Arizona. Whereas on January 8, 2011...
President, I ask unanimous consent. Further reading of the resolution be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Senator from Arizona.
Madam President, the resolution states that we honor the victims and heroes of the shooting on January 8, 2011 in Tucson, Arizona. And as we all know, and the nation and the world knows, that on January 8, the gunman opened fire at a Congress on Your Corner event hosted by Representative Gabrielle Giffords in Tucson, Arizona, killing 6 and wounding 13 others. Among those who lost their lives was 9-year-old Christina Taylor Greene, Dorothy Morris, Judge John Roll, Phyllis Schneck, and Dorwin Stoddard, and Gabrielle Matthew Zimmerman. Christina Taylor Greene was a 9-year-old daughter of John and Roxana Greene. She was born on September 11th, 2001, was a third grader with an avid interest in government who was recently elected to the student council at Mesa Verde Elementary School.
Dorothy Morris was 76 years old, attended the January 8th event with George, her husband of over 50 years, with whom she had 2 daughters and who was also critically injured as he tried to shield her from the shooting. John Roll, who I will talk about later on, is a Pennsylvania native who was 63 years old. He began his professional career as a bailiff in 1972, was appointed to the federal bench in 1991, became a chief judge for the District of Arizona in 2006. He was a devoted husband to his wife, Maureen, father to his 3 sons and grandfather to 5 grandchildren, and heroically attempted to shield Ron Barber from additional gunfire. Phyllis Schneck, a proud mother of 3, grandmother of 7, and great-grandmother from New Jersey, was spending the winter in Arizona and was a 79-year-old church volunteer and New York Giants fan. Darwin Stoddard, a 76-year-old retired construction worker and volunteer at the Mountain Avenue Church of Christ, is credited with shielding his wife, Mavie, a longtime friend whom he married while they were in their 60s, who was also injured in the shooting. Gabrielle Matthew Zimmerman, who was 30 years old and engaged to be married, served as Director of Community Outreach to Representative Gabrielle Giffords and was a social worker before serving with Representative Giffords. We all know that Gabrielle Giffords was a target of the attack and was critically injured, and we overnight have received extremely good news in that her condition has been upgraded from critical to good. That's incredible news and is heartening to all of us. 13 others were also wounded in the shooting, including Ron Barber and Pamela Simon, who were both staffers to Representative Giffords, and several individuals, including Patricia Maish, Army Colonel Bill Badger, retired, was also wounded in the shooting. Roger Salzgerber, Joseph Zamudio, Daniel Hernandez Jr., Anna Ballas, and Dr. Stephen Rail helped apprehend the gunman and assist the injured, thereby risking their lives for the safety of others. Now, some of the actions that took place during this tragedy have been carried extensively in the media. The reaction of the people of Tucson and Arizona to this tragedy has been incredibly uplifting and encouraging to all of us. There's so many stories of courage and bravery associated with this action. The quick reaction of our police and other first responders was remarkable, not to mention the incredible and extremely rapid care provided by the doctors and nurses and caregivers in Tucson. So in this great tragedy that has taken place, we can again be comforted with the knowledge that our citizens reacted in the way that Americans do, with heroism, with courage, and with sacrifice. So I think it is entirely appropriate that this resolution be passed as one of the first acts of the new Congress, of the 112th Congress of the United States Senate and House. And I want to thank all Americans for their concern, their prayers, and the sympathy and support that they have extended not only to the victims, their families, but also the people of Arizona. There will be discussion for weeks and months and years ahead as to how it was possible for this event to take place. And I don't pretend to know all of the answers. It was clearly a deranged individual, an individual who perhaps we could argue, although I can't say for certain, should have been brought to the attention, his mental illness should have been brought to the attention of the proper authorities. We do have a law that provides for such a thing in the state of Arizona. At the same time, the question needs to be asked, was his actions that we now have become very aware of, were they made aware to the proper number of people that they would take such action? The fact is that it happened. The fact is that we who are elected representatives will continue to have contact with our constituents. We will do so and not be deterred by the actions of this deranged individual. We cannot allow the actions of a deranged individual prevent us from interacting in a fundamental way with our constituents. They deserve it, and I am confident that we will be able to continue the practice of the town hall meetings, Congress on your corner, the kinds of activities that are in some ways not entirely unique to the United States of America, but certainly isn't practiced in most parts of the world. So we are encouraged by the news concerning Gabrielle Giffords, and we will harbor the hope and prayer that she will return to her duties in the United States Congress representing the people of southern Arizona. We pray for the family of Judge John Roll and those others who gave their lives. Senator Kyle and I attended the various memorial services and events that surrounding this tragedy in Tucson, and we come away obviously with deep sorrow over the event, and yet at the same time with a great deal of pride and appreciation for our fellow citizens in Arizona and Tucson who have reacted in a heroic and giving and loving and sharing fashion. So, Madam President, I guess we will be voting on this issue sometime this afternoon, and I know that other colleagues of mine will be speaking on behalf of this resolution. With that, Madam President, I would turn to the legislation. I introduced legislation to name the United States Courthouse in Yuma, Arizona, the John M. Roll United States Courthouse. Is that legislation at the desk? No. I suggest the absence of a quorum.